This time I want to describe the psychological experience of the spiritual journey, if I may be so bold. In other words, we have a brief idea of the general pathology we're dealing with. Obviously, it needs profound healing, and as I understand it, the gospel addresses itself to this pathology, to human nature, to the human condition, exactly where it is, subject to these unconscious drives that we don't even know about until we do deep psychotherapy or begin the spiritual journey and pursue it through the painful purifications that are part of the medication or part of the therapy. As you know, there's been a great traditional paradigm for the spiritual journey called the friendship of Christ, or in the Middle Ages it was called the imitation of Christ. I'm suggesting here a contemporary paradigm which does not in any way denigrate from the other two very traditional and marvelous paradigms, but adds a slightly further note to the idea of friendship with Christ. And although this isn't missing from that note, it emphasizes it from the perspective of our contemporary understanding of psychology, which it seems to me is almost a handmaid of spirituality today, you might say. And since it's street language almost, at least in the West, it's a good way of presenting the spiritual journey, as many people are turned off by some of the old terminology and the scholastic categories that even St. John of the Cross uses, because that was his cultural conditioning. So let's begin by just a dash of anthropology here, just a smattering of anthropology. The first dot represents our conception. You might call this our personal Big Bang. Because out of this moment of energy comes everything else, doesn't it? I mean, just like everything else came out of the first trillionth of a second. So we start to proceed there, and around that, this is the divine energy, the divine source. Let's call that the divine presence. Divine for short. And this first layer around it, let's call the true self, without going into the details of what that might be in intimacy, in infancy. But there's some indication that the infant is in union with God, in union with the primal energy, and experiences bliss, and experiences, an identification of this energy with its mother, to whom who means everything to it in the first year and a half or so. So the false self project, or the separate self sense, begins about a year and a half or two, when mother no longer does everything for the infant, and the infant begins to reach the conclusion that it has to go on its own, and it can't count on blissfully returning to the womb or whatever is similar to it anymore, because mama is no longer has other things to do. Now, so there begins then this development of the false self system, and that might be presented in different ways, but let's call this level around the true self our spiritual awareness, which is kind of all identified in one thing in the early year or so of life. And then we have the awareness that develops, through early childhood as the emotional programs get solidified, emotional programs for happiness, which is, we're built for happiness, so we have to look for it somewhere. And the crucial human or poignant problem is that the thing that would really give us happiness is missing in our growing up process, namely the sense of God's presence. We lose that sense of unity when we move out of the dependence on the mother. This is at least the suggestion of of several transpersonal psychologists at the present time. But this outward layer, let us call this our ordinary awareness, once we have reached the age of reason and are beginning to have an ego of our own, our rational life has reached a certain capacity to function, and we tend now to be dominated in our awareness by what goes on at the peripheral of our being, so to speak, by events, by other people, and by our emotional reactions to them. And this is precisely the level that we tried to get off temporarily in centering prayer, to have a breather or a kind of vacation, or to try to develop an awareness of the spiritual level. You might compare our ordinary awareness then, if you will, to being present at a very interesting movie, Jurassic Park or something. Everybody likes that. Or some of these new pictures that are supposed to be so engrossing. So your whole attention is focused on the screen, and you identify with the characters, and you, if it's a good enough picture, you forget that you're in the audience or in the cinema. Now, this, I suggest, is our ordinary awareness of life. We're living life as if we're at the movies. And what happens on the screen, that is outside of us, external to us, determines what our emotional reactions are, depending on what our particular energy centers are and our temperament and where you are on the Enneagram or wherever else you might be. And so our life is dominated by external experience, so that there's very little sense of the self except in moments of special intensity. And now suppose you were at a lousy movie and you don't identify with the characters, and you know you're in the theater. Now you have the freedom to get up and leave. You could also stay, if there's motives for staying. But this could be a symbol of our spiritual awareness, where our intellect in its passive capacity, that is the intuitive intellect, and the will to God are active but dormant until we waken them through some process, and life sometimes serves that process. But the spiritual journey is meant to be an awakening to that level of our being whenever you take it up. And you could take it up in adolescence, early adulthood, midlife crisis, old age, senility. You might even make it on the dying process. Some people seem to wait till the last minute. I'm hopeful that a lot of good things happen in the dying process, because I don't know when else they could happen. But in any case, then, that this process now, if you just keep in mind these various stages, notice all in a feminist circular manner.